Back in 2012, the California Stewardship Network, an alliance promoting economic vitality, and California Forward, a bipartisan good government reform effort, hosted the first ever California Economic Summit. Over the last 4 years, the summit has worked with regional and state leaders to develop a shared agenda to generate jobs and improve regional competitiveness. What do the unique regions of the state have to do to promote job creation and create a stronger economy for the state as a whole? We'll ask James Mayer, President and CEO of California Forward; Fred Silva, Senior Fiscal Policy Advisor for California Forward; Matt Lege, Research Analyst with SEIU United Health Workers; Cathy Martin, Vice President of Workforce Policy for the California Hospital Association; and Cathy Creswell, a Housing Policy Specialist with Creswell Consulting.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. The California Economic Summit is an attempt to connect regional and state leaders to develop a shared agenda to generate jobs and improve regional competitiveness. One of the founders of that effort is with us today, James Mayer, the President and CEO of Cal Forward, a bipartisan good government reform group. Welcome to Maddy Report.
Happy to be here.
So Jim, tell us a little bit about the California Economic Summit, the who, what, when, where, why, how. Who's involved? What's the general idea?
We launched this about 5 years ago in this partnership with those regional organizations you mentioned, because there was the belief that the state really didn't have a coherent plan to do economic recovery and grow the kind of resilient economies we needed at the community and regional level. And we needed a venue to bring together state, local, regional leaders from public, private, and civic sectors to really figure out what those policy drivers were and then to steadily make progress towards what we wanted in state law and local practice.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seemed like you had silos before, right? The state was doing its thing or the localities were doing its thing. You've kind of done a hybrid approach, it sounds like, with this regional approach.
Absolutely. And what we found was the regions actually had economic strategies, but they hadn't counted on any action from the state. They literally had written off the state as a partner, but yet they need the state. They need the state resources. The state regulations are either helping or hurting them. And this has created a way to both connect what regions were needing to do and candidly gave state leaders a sound way of understanding what regions needed.
You know, I remember we were doing the California partnership with the San Joaquin Valley. That was one of these kinds of regional efforts, and legislators were going to this partnership and saying, what legislation do you need to help move whatever the agenda was for, whether it's air quality or economic development, what have you. So I assume that you've got some, with the summit, you set up some annual goals. How do you make sure those goals are accomplished?
Well, so we do set annual goals, and we base that on the priorities of the regions. And each year we have work that's underway around workforce and around infrastructure investment. And we work on those goals all year long, and then people come together at the summit each year to assess the progress, to identify what we need to get done in the next year or so, and then to organize and commit to moving those things forward. So there's literally hundreds of people involved in the Economic Summit. It's an event. It's a great event. People want to come, they network, it's exciting, they get to meet people from different regions and at the state. But the real heavy work happens the other 364 days of the year.
Yeah, I want to ask you, this has been in existence since 2012. Can you point to some tangible improvements, changes that have come about as a result of the summit?
Absolutely. One of the biggest high priorities in every region is growing their human capital, workforce development, making sure we've got enough people with the skills necessary to fuel their economies and get jobs that are paying enough to help them support their families. And there's been steady progress in identifying things that the state needed to do to grow that CTE pipeline, and we've had a number of bills.
Career technical education.
Career technical education, and this is advanced manufacturing and healthcare and working in the green economy, lots of very tangible jobs. And this last year, in partnership with the California Community College Chancellor's Office, we championed and got through the Strong Workforce Program, which puts not only more money into this, but does it exactly the way the regions wanted. Regional colleges have to cooperate with each other and consult with their employers. The money is going to flow based on need and ability to make a difference in people's lives.
So it's real skills that are attached to real jobs that employers say they need.
And there's a performance and accountability built into this to make sure it actually works.
You know, it's interesting, you look at statistics and you find that, you know, the middle class is shrinking, poverty is growing. There's really no easy fix here, is there? I mean, there's no silver bullet. It's a multiple multitude of things we need to do.
One of the things we're doing in this summit is we've done some analysis about what are all those primary drivers for both persistent poverty or lack of upward mobility. And it's very clear we're going to have to both grow workforce but also grow jobs. And we're going to have to do something about the high cost of living, particularly housing. The mix of those things are different in every region, but every region has to tackle those.
You know, it's a really interesting point about housing that you're making, that when you look at studies, they say that's a big driver for poverty in California, because people are spending over a third of their salaries on housing alone. That's a big deal.
And in fact, wages are not going to rise as fast as housing prices, so we're actually going to lose ground against poverty. The summit is the only place where all of those stakeholders that fight about that issue come together to talk about things they can agree on in the context of all the people who are impacted by the answers, the millennial leaders, the employers. The Hospital Association cares as much about housing as they do workforce. This is what the summit is, the place where people come together to talk about the big solutions.
December 13th and 14th in Sacramento. You know, I want to ask you about the summit. They're really focusing on 3 issues. They are housing, workforce issues, and water infrastructure. Why those 3 issues? And I'm wondering, is any one more important than the other? Are they interdependent?
No, they aren't, and they are independent. And
interdependent, you're saying.
They are interdependent, and if those 3 drivers I just referenced are actually represented by those. So workforce is clearly a big issue here. People have to be able to participate in this economy. Housing is the single biggest cost driver to our cost of living. And infrastructure is usually the first thing we look to government do in terms of trying to help create jobs. And so part of this year, so we've always been we try to be big enough to impact the solution, but specific enough to make progress. It's walking that fine line. This year we're going to look at what we've done and ask ourselves, do we have a broad enough, deep enough agenda that we're advancing fast enough to actually restore upward mobility?
Well, I want to thank James Mayer from California Forward for joining us. Up next, we're going to talk about one of those issues, infrastructure issues generally, and water in particular. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Some suggest with some alarm that California's infrastructure is stressed beyond capacity. How does the state do more to invest in things like bridges, roads, airports, rail lines, pipes to maintain our economic competitiveness? Our guest is Fred Silva, Senior Fiscal Policy Advisor with California Forward. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark.
So, roads. People say they're crumbling. Water, where is it? Yet there doesn't appear to be a big appetite for spending money to fix these problems. What's the summit's prescription?
Well, you know, the summit has focused on the strength of our economic regions and where the investment should take place. Frankly, the state has been ambivalent about that. Currently, on the November ballot, there are 13 counties that have sales tax increases to invest more in transportation. Over half of the state's population will be participating in that discussion. So the state looks at transportation finance as a need to fix it first. They want to repair roads. But the question is, how do we add capacity to our growing economic regions? And for that, the summit has had as a priority to have means to do that, creating 2 years ago something known as a new financing authority known as Enhanced Infrastructure Finance.
You know, I wanted to ask you about those Enhanced Infrastructure Financing Districts. How do they work?
Well, the whole concept is to take, as I mentioned, a regional approach to transportation needs or water resource needs or other infrastructure needs, to bring counties and cities and special districts together to use their financing capacity to continue investments in their regional economies.
You know, it sounds like a little bit like the self-help transportation taxes that some counties pass, like in Fresno County, for example, Measure C, as a way to kind of give more money for road projects. are you seeing more counties doing that?
Yes, indeed. That's partly because the state has not been interested in putting more money into transportation capacity. They're interested in putting more money into the maintenance of the state highway system. But when it comes to connectivity between the eastern part of Los Angeles and the western part of Los Angeles, they frankly have had limited interest, which is why so much local initiative and local interest is there. What we tried to do with this new financing authority is to bring both counties and cities together in order to capture the growth of their own economies and invest that into infrastructure.
It's also that you can leverage that money. So a lot of times when you go out to get federal or state grants, they want you to match those funds. If you have local funds to match them, then you double the impact.
Exactly, and that's partly why the summit took on that agenda rather than just trying to convince the state to put more money in to get, again, the growth in the local economies to be able to provide that match to state interest if we could get the state to put more resources in.
It sounds a little bit like this is almost like redevelopment agencies 2.0. Is this similar to a redevelopment agency?
Well, it's a bit different. Remember that this happened after the repeal of redevelopment, where the summit,
is this filling that gap?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason that this got on the agenda of the summit in 2014 is that the question was, do we replace redevelopment? And the answer to that from local civic folks who were engaged in it said, actually, we don't want to simply put redevelopment back. We want a broader set of authorities, which is why they went with enhancing or improving the infrastructure financing district statute that was already on the books.
Do you have some examples of where this has been implemented successfully?
Yeah, it's being implemented at this stage where cities, and in some cases cities and counties, are doing all the feasibility work to put that together. The city of Laverne is working with the county of Los Angeles to put together a mixed-use housing and transportation project. Now, because this statute is fairly new, the battery of economic development consultants and lawyers and the rest of it are beginning to put the framework together. Once those cities start that process, then we believe that more and more cities and counties in sub-regions, whether it's the San Gabriel Valley or in the South Bay in San Francisco, or for that matter, the southern part of the valley, will see the ease with which these financing authorities can be put together.
Yeah, it's a wide array of projects that you can do with these districts.
Yes.
Besides these, and I don't remember the name here, enhanced infrastructure finance districts. You need an acronym, something shorter than that. But anyway, in addition to that, any other money coming from any other sources?
Well, there are resources that come from the state through the state's water bond. Mm-hmm. Those resources often require some local match, as you mentioned before, and so that's why it's important for these two things to be aligned with both state money and federal money. I'm sorry, state money and local money. The federal government has put less and less resources into infrastructure, and it's hard to know when they'll come to grips with it.
Kind of like, it sounds like pulling up yourself by your own bootstraps in many ways. Let me ask you this though, what does the Economic Summit hope to accomplish when it comes to infrastructure issues?
Well, this next summit, which will be in December, we're focusing on two issues. One of them is the infrastructure needed for housing. Because these issues are all interrelated, housing is related to jobs, jobs are related to housing. Infrastructure supports housing and supports those families that live in those houses. So we're going to be focusing on how to get more infrastructure related to housing, whether it's water or transportation or waste management.
Yeah, and then there's also workforce development, which is the third part of that process. Right. I want to thank Fred Silva from Cal Ford for joining us. Up next, we're going to talk about the 1 million qualified worker challenge that's part of the Economic Summit. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Projections are that California could be short 1 million qualified workers over the next 10 years. How can we avert that economic catastrophe? Our guests have not only been studying the problem, they've been living it. Cathy Martin is the Vice President of Workforce Policy for the California Hospital Association. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And Matt Lege is a research analyst with SEIU, UHW, United Health Workers. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So Cathy, let me start with you. Most employers tell you that, their need is really for qualified workers. That's really the problem here. Why is California so short in the number of qualified workers that it needs?
Well, the shortage of skilled workers is really not a California-only problem. It's a nationwide problem. Baby boomers are at retirement age, and they are retiring in great numbers and all at once. For healthcare, this is complicated by the fact that we have nurses and critical health professionals leaving the workforce all at one time, while at the same time we have this increased need for healthcare services because we have this older population
Aging
to care
population.
for, we have sicker patients, and then we have the Affordable Care Act, which has expanded coverage, so more people have
You're getting hit
access
by
to
double
coverage.
whammies or triple whammies
Exactly. So it's a perfect storm brewing out there where we have the need for skilled workers, yet a scarcity of workers.
Yeah. Now it's interesting, Matt, you're with a union, Service Employees International Union, a very big union. Why would a union care about workforce development and qualified workers? I would think that would be a management issue.
No, this is an issue for all of California. For us, we think about it when there's a shortage of healthcare workers, it causes delays in access to care. And we know that that can have detrimental effects on our communities. And as it's against our values of healthcare workers to cause those sorts of things. So we know that we need to develop the workforce. On top of that, we know that these are good middle-class jobs, and we have to make sure that there's pathways for people to be able to get those jobs in California.
It's interesting to see the cooperation between management and labor on addressing an issue. And as a labor management arbitrator, I'm happy to see you guys do that. So, Cathy, the Economic Summit is talking about something called a Strong Workforce Program. What specifically is that? How would it work?
Well, the Economic Summit's support of a strong workforce program was really instrumental in bringing together education, business, government, and labor so that we could work together on ensuring that California employers have the skilled workforce we need now and in the future so that we can keep California globally competitive from an economic standpoint. Through the Strong Workforce Task Force, leaders throughout California came together to develop recommendations that would move the state forward in terms of career technical education, which is where many of these workers attain their education and their skills. These, as Matt said, these are good jobs, high demand, and good wages. So we want to really make sure that the state has the capacity to provide that education and training, and the summit helps support the efforts of the Strong Workforce Program.
Yeah, and that career technical education, those are really good jobs that can come out of that. And people don't realize, I think they need a 4-year college degree. Maybe not so much. You can go to a community college, get some great training for a job that pays very well.
Absolutely.
Matt, let me ask you this. Do you think this approach that the Economic Summit has really seems to be a regional approach? Why do you think a regional approach is better than, let's say, a monolithic statewide approach?
Yeah, well, the most important part about the regional approach is because the needs of the Bay Area, Los Angeles, and Fresno are different, and particularly for healthcare workers. In Los Angeles, you need many more bilingual speakers, and in Bay Area, you need different types of workers as well. Fresno, you need much more experience with asthma care. So the regional approach allows you to meet those regional needs and bring together the community, labor organizations, employers, so they can all provide students and local employers for the right skill set.
Do you agree?
Absolutely, and I think that through a regional sector strategy approach, we can really leverage all of the assets in a region in a much more efficient way with diminishing resources for everyone. We need to come together as regions to look at how we can solve some of our workforce problems.
It's interesting, it seems like you're breaking down some of those silos. And it used to be the state as one silo, or maybe each local community, but you're saying, no, there's a hybrid here, a regional approach.
Yes.
Because the reality is that problems don't stop at borders, right? I mean, if between cities or between counties, it's usually region-wide. We certainly see that in the San Joaquin Valley. Cathy, let me ask you this. You got this 1 million worker goal, a huge goal, in 10 years. What are the short-term goals to reach that long-term goal?
Well, the 1 million goal is not just healthcare, so I think it's important to point that out. That's really, 1 million workers that
qualified
we need.
Workers, correct.
Qualified workers. But I think for, one of the recommendations that came out of the Strong Workforce Task Force was the need for the community colleges who are providing much of this training and education to be able to respond to industry quickly. And if that means a new program for a high demand occupation needs to be developed, the college needs the ability to put that together quickly. So one of the recommendations was to streamline and shorten the curriculum approval process. And that's important, especially for California hospital members, because when we're a rapidly changing industry and we need programs to come up quickly.
Connecting it to the real world, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
So Matt, let me ask you this. 1 million more qualified workers. How are we going to know if this goal has been achieved?
Well, we need to continue to push for some of the short-term goals, like a streamlined curriculum, like Cathy mentioned, and ensure that we continue to have a system that supports workers through that process and students through that process, because these are really demanding career and training courses. And if we can't have a system that supports people, then they really we won't have the type of workforce we need. And these are good paying jobs, and people want these jobs, but it can be very difficult to overcome all the sort of barriers that are currently in place.
Okay, well, I want to thank Matt Lege with SEIU and Cathy Martin with the Hospital Association for joining us. So where are those workers going to live? Up next, a conversation about California's housing crisis and trying to build 1 million new homes in the next decade. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. The nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office has cited housing, particularly along the coast, as a major contributor to income inequality. What can be done to address California's housing crisis? Our guest is Cathy Creswell, a housing policy specialist with Creswell Consulting. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So what are the main issues that are adversely affecting the supply of housing?
Well, there's a lot of things, and it's a very complex, but predominantly we're looking at the supply of housing, both how it is zoned and regulated in terms of whether it's providing a mix of housing for ownership as well as renter households. Also the regulation of housing, so local governments can control how much density is provided, the cost through requirements of high parking requirements, also the funding and financing of housing. So we don't have enough resources to actually fund and support affordable development. And then in addition, all of the infrastructure and all the systems needed to help development occur in the right places are also lacking. So we need more infrastructure resources. And then in addition, there is a fundamental lack of support for growth and housing development in particular, which really impacts our ability to get the amount of housing and the affordability of housing we need.
Is this a statewide issue, or is this a local issue, specific, let's say, to the coast?
No, it is absolutely a statewide issue. While the problems along our coastline are probably most severe, we have a statewide problem. There isn't a county in California which doesn't have a shortage of affordable housing.
And when you define affordable housing, you're saying we spend more than 30% of your take-home pay basically on housing.
Yes, yes.
That's a chunk of change. I mean, if you add that, you add a car, you add food, and not much left over.
And lower income households are paying up to 50 and 60% and more of their need. But it's also, we are 12% of the nation's population, and we have 20% of the homeless population. Median incomes are going down at the same time rents and ownership or median value of homes is going up. And even in places that are generally considered affordable, for example, Sacramento and Santa Barbara, in both of those places there are only 18 to 19 available and affordable homes for every 100 extremely low-income households who need them. So it is definitely statewide.
Is it also not just geographic or in general regions, but also actually where housing is built? Like, is it near jobs or is it near transit? Is that also an issue?
Yes, really across the state we need housing everywhere, but we also need to put housing where it can have both co-benefits. So when we are doing transit-oriented housing along transit corridors, we are reducing commute times, which increases worker productivity. We are reducing climate change, or we are addressing climate objectives. When we build infill, we are addressing potentially the need in rural and some of the Central Valley areas, the need to, less of a need to convert ag land, and also meeting environmental goals. So you're right. And when we do housing right in the right locations, we can have many multiple benefits.
What actions are being proposed in this California Economic Summit to meet this 1 million home challenge?
So we're looking at a combination of fiscal and regulatory reforms. So recognizing the need on the fiscal that we need a permanent funding source that would help subsidize housing for that segment of our communities that the market will never be able to meet. Elderly, disabled, chronic homeless. So we need the state to provide a permanent, regular funding source. And then we also need to look at incentivizing local governments.
Now, I was going to ask you, is that where kind of the action is a lot with local governments in terms of reducing impact fees, which is a big deal, or regulations?
Absolutely. The most critical decisions about housing supply and affordability happen at the local level. And so we need to help incentivize local governments to make some of the tough choices that they are forced to make when there is a lack of resources, there is a lack of infrastructure. And so we want to look at, for those communities who are trying to do the right thing, providing a mechanism that would enable them to have a greater share of the property tax when they are perhaps making some of the regulatory reforms that we think that are needed to expedite processing, to create more certainty in the processing, and then to actually link real outcomes with those incentives.
It's all connected. I want to thank Cathy Creswell for joining us and the other members of the California Economic Summit. Remember, it's December 13th and 14th in Sacramento. If you want to stay up with state and local politics, you can follow the Maddy Institute on Facebook, Twitter, or log on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.